The train whistle echoed through the Colorado mountains as Clara pressed her face against the cold window glass. In her trembling hands, she clutched a worn photograph of a man she'd never met, but was about to marry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Brennan had kind eyes in the picture, she thought, and his letter had been gentle, promising her a new life in Copper Falls where the silver mines ran deep and the future seemed bright. She'd left behind nothing but poverty and heartache. In Ohio, carrying only a small trunk and dreams of becoming someone's cherished wife. But when the train finally hissed to a stop at the weathered platform, no one was there to meet her. The conductor helped her down with her belongings, tipping his hat as he muttered something about being sorry for her troubles. Clara didn't understand what he meant until she saw the cluster of women in black dresses gathered near the station house, their faces etched with grief that seemed to hang in the mountain air like morning fog. "Are you the bride?" asked a woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, stepping forward from the group. "Thomas Brennan's intended?" Clara nodded, her heart beginning to race as she noticed how the woman's voice caught on his name. "Oh, child," the woman whispered, reaching for Clara's hands. "I'm so sorry. There's been an accident." The autumn of 1892 had painted the Colorado mountains in brilliant golds and crimsons, but in Copper Falls, the beauty felt hollow. Clara Whitmore had traveled over 1,000 miles from her cramped boarding house room in Cleveland, carrying nothing but a battered trunk and a heart full of carefully guarded hope. At 24, she'd already buried her parents, worked her fingers raw in a textile mill, and watched too many dreams slip away like smoke. When Thomas Brennan's letter arrived, written in careful penmanship and filled with promises of a home, a garden, and a man who would value her companionship, it felt like salvation wrapped in simple brown paper. She'd spent her last savings on the train ticket and a modest blue dress that she hoped would make her appear worthy of love. During the long journey west, she'd read his letters over and over until the paper grew soft from handling. Thomas wrote about his work in the Silver Creek mine, how he'd saved enough money to build a small house on Maple Street, complete with a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the mountains purple. He'd mentioned his dream of someday opening a general store, leaving the dangerous underground work behind for something safer, something that would let him come home to her every night without coal dust in his lungs. But Thomas Brennan would never come home again. Ruth Morrison, the silver-haired woman who'd approached her at the station, owned the Miners' Rest Inn and had the gentle way of someone who'd delivered too much bad news in her lifetime. She guided Clara to a wooden bench outside the station house, sitting beside her as she explained what had happened 3 days earlier. A support beam in the deepest tunnel of Silver Creek Mine had given way without warning, bringing down tons of rock and timber in a thunderous crash that shook the entire mountain. 12 men had been working that shift. Only 4 made it out alive. Thomas had been among the 8 who didn't. Clara listened to the words, but they seemed to float around her like echoes in a canyon, never quite settling into meaning. She found herself staring at the photograph in her lap, at Thomas's serious face and kind eyes, trying to reconcile the living man in the picture with the reality that he was gone. She'd never spoken to him, never heard his laugh, never felt his hand in hers. Yet somehow his death carved out a hollow space in her chest that ached with surprising intensity. "Where will you go now, dear?" Ruth asked gently, her weathered hand covering Clara's. "Do you have family back east? Someone who could send you train fare home?" Clara shook her head slowly. There was no home to return to, no family waiting, no job that would take her back after she'd given notice to come west for a wedding that would never happen. Her small savings had been spent on the journey, leaving her with barely enough coins in her purse to buy a meal. She was stranded in a town that was grieving, among people she didn't know, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. "You'll stay at the inn," Ruth declared with the firmness of someone accustomed to solving problems. "At least until you can. Figure out what comes next. No charge, child. The Lord knows we've all been through enough heartache this week without adding to it." The Miners' Rest Inn stood 3 stories tall on Main Street, its wooden siding weathered grey by mountain, winds and winter storms. Ruth led Clara up narrow stairs to a small room on the 2nd floor, simply furnished with an iron bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains, where Silver Creek Mine sat like a wound on the hillside. Even from this distance, Clara could see the activity around the mine entrance, tiny figures moving back and forth in what looked like organized chaos. "They're still digging," Ruth explained, noticing Clara's gaze. "James Patterson, he's the rescue leader they brought. In from Denver, he won't give up until every man is accounted for. Been working day and night since it happened, barely stopping to eat or sleep." Clara unpacked her few belongings in silence, hanging her dresses in the narrow wardrobe and arranging her toiletries on the washstand. Each item she placed felt like evidence of the life she'd expected to build, now rendered meaningless by circumstance. The wedding dress she'd sewn by candlelight remained folded in tissue paper at the bottom of her trunk, a white cotton symbol of hopes that felt foolish. Now, that evening, she sat by her window watching the lanterns flicker around the mine site, wondering about the man named James who was still fighting to bring the dead home to their families. She'd learned from Ruth that he'd lost his own father in a mine collapse years earlier, which explained why he traveled from disaster to disaster, leading rescue operations with a dedication that bordered on obsession. There was something both admirable and heartbreaking about a man who made other people's tragedies his life's work. The next morning brought news that sent a ripple of excitement through the small town. James and his crew had broken through to a pocket where they believed some of the missing miners might still be alive. Clara found herself drawn to Main Street, where crowds had gathered to wait for updates. She stood at the edge of the group, feeling like an outsider to their shared hope and grief, yet unable to pull herself away from the drama unfolding on the mountainside. It was there, watching the frantic activity around the mine entrance, that she first saw James Patterson himself. He emerged from the tunnel opening covered in dust and sweat, his dark hair plastered to his head, his shirt torn from crawling through tight spaces. Even at a distance, she could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he moved like a man carrying the weight of too many lives on his conscience. He spoke briefly to someone, gestured toward the mine, then disappeared back into the darkness, without pause. "He's been down there for 16 hours straight," someone in the crowd murmured. "Won't let anyone else take the lead on the dangerous work." Clara found herself thinking about James Patterson long after she returned to her room. At the inn, there was something compelling about his dedication, the way he threw himself into saving people he'd never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. She'd known so many men who made grand promises with their words, while their actions told different stories. But here was a man whose actions spoke louder than any letter ever could. As the days passed, Clara fell into an unexpected routine in Copper Falls. Ruth put her to work helping at the inn, grateful for an extra pair of hands during the crisis that had brought reporters and rescue workers to fill every available room. Clara cooked meals, changed linens, and listened to the stories of wives and mothers who came looking for news about their men. She discovered that grief was a language everyone spoke, regardless of their background or circumstances. The work felt good, purposeful in a way her factory job never had. At the textile mill, she'd been just another pair of hands feeding fabric through machines. Here, she was helping people navigate the worst moments of their lives, offering comfort through simple acts of service. When Mrs. Henderson broke down crying while waiting for news about her husband, Clara held her hand and listened. When young, Billy Stevens worried aloud that his father might never come home. Clara found words of hope that surprised her with their sincerity. But it was the stories about James Patterson that began to capture her imagination. The townspeople spoke of him with a mixture of awe and concern, describing his tireless work ethic and his refusal to give up even when others had lost hope. She learned that he'd been personally responsible for saving dozens of lives over the years, that he asked for no payment beyond basic expenses, and that he carried the weight of every person he couldn't save. "He's a good man," Ruth said one evening as they cleaned up after serving dinner to a room full of worried families. "But he's got ghosts following him. Lost his father when he was just 15, then his younger brother in another collapse too. Years later, some folks say he's trying to save everyone else because he couldn't save them." Clara understood something about ghosts and guilt. She'd carried her own share of both, wondering if she could have done more to help her parents before they died, questioning every decision that had led her to this strange town where she felt simultaneously lost and found. Perhaps that was why she felt drawn to a man she'd only glimpsed from a distance, someone who seemed to understand that sometimes the hardest battles were fought not against external circumstances, but against the voices in your own head that whispered you weren't enough. On the 5th day after the collapse, James and his crew finally broke through to the trapped miners. 3 men emerged alive, blinking in the sunlight like creatures from another world. The celebration in Copper Falls was subdued, tempered by the knowledge that 5 men, including Thomas Brennan, would never walk out of that mountain again. But 3 families had their loved ones back, and that was enough to remind everyone that hope and heartbreak could exist in the same moment. Clara watched from her window as James finally emerged from the mine for the last time that day. He walked slowly, his head down, probably thinking about the 5 men who would be buried instead of rescued. She wanted to go to him, to offer some word of comfort or gratitude, but what could she possibly say? "Thank you for trying to save the man I was supposed to marry but never got the chance to love." Instead, she remained at her window, watching as he cleaned up at the wash station the rescue crew had set up outside the mine entrance. Even from a distance, she could see the careful way he moved, like someone who'd been pushed beyond his physical limits but refused to acknowledge it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When he finished washing, he stood for a long moment looking up at the mountains, and Clara found herself wondering what he saw there, what thoughts occupied a mind that had spent days crawling through darkness to bring light to others. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of a town trying to process tragedy and relief in equal measure, Clara realized something had shifted inside her. The grief over Thomas's death remained, but it had transformed from sharp pain into something softer, more like regret for possibilities that would never be explored. She was sorry he was gone, sorry for the life they might have built together, but she was no longer devastated by the loss of a future she'd never really owned. Instead, she found herself curious about different possibilities, different futures that might unfold in this mountain town where people faced hardship with quiet courage and helped each other through the darkest times. She thought about James Patterson, about the dedication she'd witnessed and the loneliness she'd recognized in his solitary work. She wondered if someone who spent his life saving others had anyone to save him from the weight of his own burdens. These were dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position, stranded and dependent on the kindness of strangers. But as Clara drifted off to sleep, she allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she decided to stay in Copper Falls, to build something new from the ashes of her original plans. After all, she'd already proven she was brave enough to travel across the country for love. Perhaps she was brave enough to stay for something even more precious, something that couldn't be captured in letters or promised in photographs. Perhaps. She was brave enough to stay for the possibility of finding herself. The funeral for the 5 miners took place on a grey Tuesday morning when low clouds hung over Copper Falls like a shroud. Clara stood at the back of the small church, feeling the weight of being an outsider among people united by shared loss. She wore her modest black dress, the one she'd brought for travelling, and watched as wives and children said goodbye to men who'd kissed them goodbye just days earlier, never knowing it would be the last time. Thomas Brennan had no family present, except for a distant cousin who'd travelled from Denver, a thin man with nervous hands who kept checking his pocket watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. Clara found herself standing beside the cousin during the service, accepting condolences from townspeople who assumed she was grieving a deep love rather than mourning possibilities she'd never had the chance to explore. After the service, as people gathered in the church basement for coffee and shared memories, Clara met Thomas's closest friend, Ben Murphy, who worked as the mine foreman. Ben was a stocky man with greying hair and eyes that seemed older than his years. Someone who carried the responsibility of sending men into dangerous places every day and living with the consequences when things went wrong. "Thomas talked about you constantly the last few months," Ben told her, accepting a cup of coffee from her hands. "Showed everyone your photograph, read parts of your letters out loud during lunch breaks. He was so excited about building a life with you, about having someone to come home to every evening." Clara felt her throat tighten at the image of Thomas sharing her words with his friends, making her reel to them before she'd ever stepped foot in Colorado. "I wish I could have known him," she said quietly. "He seemed like a good man from his letters." "The best," Ben agreed. "Never complained about the work, always looked out for the younger miners, saved his money instead of spending it on whiskey like some of the others. He had plans, real plans for the future." Ben paused, studying Clara's face. "What will you do now? Ruth mentioned you might stay in town for a while." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Clara wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have nowhere else to go, really. Ruth has been kind enough to let me work at the inn, but that can't last forever." Ben nodded slowly, then seemed to make a decision. "Thomas had savings," he said, "a decent amount put aside for your new life together. His cousin doesn't want it, says it rightfully belongs to you since Thomas intended it for your future. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get you back east if that's what you want, or enough to help you start fresh here if you decide to stay." The unexpected news left Clara speechless. She'd assumed Thomas's death meant losing not only a future husband but any financial security he might have provided. To learn that he'd saved money specifically for their shared life, money that could now give her choices she'd thought were lost, felt like receiving a gift from beyond the grave. That afternoon, she walked through Copper Falls with new eyes, seeing it not as a place where she was stranded, but as somewhere she might choose to build a life. The town was smaller than Cleveland, certainly, with muddy streets and buildings that showed the wear of mountain weather. But there was something appealing about the way people greeted each other by name, the way neighbors helped neighbors without being asked. She found herself drawn to the area around the mine, where James Patterson and his crew were packing up their equipment. The rescue operation was officially over, the mine sealed until engineers could determine if it would ever be safe to reopen. James worked alongside his men, coiling ropes and loading tools into wagons with the same methodical care he'd shown during the rescue efforts. Clara had been watching from a distance for several minutes when James looked up and caught her eye. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the dusty clearing, two people connected by tragedy and circumstance. Then James straightened, wiped his hands on his work pants, and walked toward her with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who'd been making difficult decisions all his life. "You're Thomas Brennan's intended," he said when he reached her, his voice rough from days of breathing dust and shouting orders underground. It wasn't a question. "I was," Clara replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I'm Clara. Whitmore. James Patterson." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. "I'm sorry for your loss. I knew Thomas, worked with him on a rescue operation in Leadville last year. He was a good man. Talked about you often during the work." Oh, Clara felt that familiar tightness in her chest at hearing about Thomas's feelings for her, feelings she'd never had the chance to return or reject. "Thank you for everything you did to try to save them," she said. "I know you went beyond what anyone could have expected." James replaced his hat, pulling the brim low over his eyes. "Not beyond what they deserved," he said simply. "Every man who goes underground has people waiting for him to come home. They all deserve every effort we can give." There was something in the way he spoke about the miners, with a respect that went deeper than professional obligation, that made Clara want to know more about this man who'd spent days risking his own life for people he barely knew. "Ruth mentioned you've been doing this kind of work for years," she said. "It must be difficult, going from one tragedy to another." "Someone has to do it," James replied, but Clara caught something in his expression that suggested the work was more than duty for him, something closer to penance or calling. "Most folks don't have the training or the equipment. If I can help bring people home to their families, then the difficult parts are worth it." They stood in comfortable silence, for a moment, watching as James's crew finished loading their wagon. Clara noticed that despite their exhaustion, the men worked with quiet efficiency, treating their equipment with the respect of people who knew their tools might mean the difference between life and death on the next job. "Where will you go next?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure why the answer mattered to her. "Back to Denver for now," James said. "There's always another mine, another accident waiting to happen. Mining companies are starting to pay for proper rescue training, so I spend time teaching crews how to handle emergencies before they become tragedies." Clara found herself imagining James traveling from town to town, always arriving after disaster had struck, always leaving once the dead were counted and the living were safe. It seemed like a lonely way to live, defined by other people's worst moments and measured by problems solved rather than connections made. "What about you?" James asked, turning the question back to her. "Will you return east?" The question she'd been avoiding all week suddenly demanded an answer. Clara looked around at the mountains surrounding Copper Falls, at the mine that had taken Thomas's life but also revealed James's character, at the town that had welcomed her with unexpected kindness during its own time of grief. "I'm thinking about staying," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "At least for a while. There's nothing for me back in Ohio, and Ruth says there's always work for someone willing to do it. Maybe it's time I stopped running toward other people's dreams and started building my own." James studied her face for a long moment, and Clara had the distinct feeling he was seeing something in her that she was just beginning to recognize in herself. "It takes courage to start over in a new place," he said finally, "especially after the kind of loss you've experienced. Sometimes courage is just stubbornness wearing a prettier dress," Clara replied, earning what might have been the beginning of a smile from James. "In my experience, there's not much difference between the two," he said. "Both can get you through times when giving up seems easier." The conversation was interrupted by one of James's crew members, calling for his attention about a wagon wheel that needed adjusting before they could leave town. James excused himself with a polite touch to his hat brim, but as he walked away, Clara noticed him glance back once, as if he was trying to memorize something about the moment. That evening, Clara sat in the inn's common room with Ruth, helping to mend linens while they talked about practical matters like wages and living arrangements. Ruth had offered Clara a permanent position at the inn, including a small room of her own and meals in exchange for helping with the cooking, cleaning, and guest services. It wasn't the life Clara had imagined when she left Ohio, but it offered something she'd never had before: independence and the chance to make her own choices. "You sure about this, dear?" Ruth asked, threading a needle by lamplight. "It's not easy work, and the winters here can be brutal. Some folks find the isolation gets to them after a while." Clara considered the question seriously. She'd spent most of her life feeling isolated even when surrounded by people, working jobs that paid barely enough to survive while dreaming of something better. The prospect of hard work in a small mountain town didn't frighten her as much as the idea of returning to a life where she was always waiting for someone else to make her dreams possible. "I'm sure," she said, surprising herself again with how certain she felt. "I want to build something here, something that's mine." Ruth smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Then we'll make a good team. Lord knows this place could use someone with your energy and common sense." Later that night, Clara stood at her window watching the last lights go out in the houses scattered across the hillsides around Copper Falls. In one of those houses, James Patterson was probably preparing for his departure tomorrow, packing the life he carried from place to place into saddlebags and traveling cases. In a few days he'd be gone, and she'd be left to build her new life without ever really knowing the man whose dedication had impressed her so deeply. The thought bothered her more than it should have, given that she'd spoken to James for perhaps 10 minutes total. But there had been something in their brief conversation, a recognition that went beyond polite sympathy, that made her feel like she'd glimpsed something important about both him and herself. He was a man who understood loss and purpose, who'd turned his own pain into something that helped others. She was a woman learning to turn disappointment into opportunity, to find strength in starting over. Maybe that was enough of a foundation for friendship, if nothing else. The next morning, Clara woke early and made her way to the kitchen to help Ruth prepare breakfast for the inn's guests. The routine of cooking and serving gave her hands something to do, while her mind processed the enormous changes in her life. A week ago, she'd been Clara Whitmore, the spinster millworker traveling west to marry a stranger. Today, she was Clara Whitmore, the innkeeper's assistant building a life in the Colorado mountains. She was carrying a tray of coffee to the dining room when she saw James Patterson sitting alone at a corner table, eating breakfast with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to quick meals before long journeys. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his hair neat and his clothes free of mind dust, but he still carried that air of quiet intensity she'd noticed during their conversation. Clara approached his table with the coffee pot, trying to keep her voice casual. "More coffee before you head out?" James looked up from his plate, and Clara caught a flicker of something that might have been pleasure in his expression before. It settled back into polite neutrality. "Thank you," he said, holding out his cup. "You're up early for someone who's not leaving town." "Ruth and I have an inn to run," Clara replied, filling his cup carefully. "Besides, I've always been an early riser, old habits from factory work." "You worked in a factory back east?" James asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Textile mill in Cleveland," Clara said, surprised by his interest. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, feeding fabric through machines that never stopped making noise. Not exactly exciting work, but it paid enough to keep me fed and housed. James nodded slowly, as if filing away this information about her background. "That's honest work," he said. "Takes discipline to stick with something like that, especially when you're young and probably had other dreams." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at his understanding. Most people, when they learned about her factory work, either looked down on her or dismissed it as something any woman could do. James spoke about it with respect, recognizing the dedication it required. "What about you?" she asked, settling. The coffee pot on the table for a moment. How did you get into rescue work? James's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Lost my father in a mine collapse when I was 15, he said after a pause. Spent 3 days digging with my bare hands before the official rescue team arrived. Swore I'd learn how to do it properly so other families wouldn't have to wait like we did. The simple statement carried weight that made Clara's chest ache with sympathy. She could imagine a 15-year-old boy frantically clawing at rocks and timber, driven by desperation and love, probably bloodying his hands in a futile attempt to save someone who was already gone. "Did you find him?" she asked gently. "Eventually," James said, his voice steady but distant. "Too late, but we brought him home for burial. Sometimes that's the best you can do." Clara understood then why James threw himself so completely into rescue work, why he crawled through dangerous spaces and worked without rest when other people's lives hung in the balance. He was still that 15-year-old boy, still trying to save his father, still believing that enough effort and determination could change the outcome of tragedies. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it deeply. James nodded his thanks, then seemed to shake off the weight of memory. "What made you decide to stay in Copper Falls?" he asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. Clara considered her answer carefully. She could give him the practical reasons about work and money, or she could tell him something closer to the truth about feeling like she'd found a place where she could become the person she was meant to be. "I realized I'd been spending my whole life waiting for something to happen to me instead of making things happen," she said finally. "Coming west was supposed to be about marrying Thomas and letting him take care of me, but that plan fell apart before it began. Maybe it's time I learned to take care of myself." James studied her face as she spoke, and Clara had the feeling he was seeing past her words to something deeper. "Independence can be lonely," he said quietly. "So can depending on other people," Clara replied. "At least when you're taking care of yourself, you know exactly who's responsible for the outcome." Something shifted in James's expression, a recognition that made Clara feel like they were finally talking about something real instead of exchanging polite conversation. "That's true," he said. "Though sometimes carrying all the responsibility yourself can be its own kind of burden." Clara sensed they were talking about more than her decision to stay in Copper Falls, but before she could explore the topic further, Ruth appeared in the doorway of the dining room, gesturing for Clara's help with something in the kitchen. "I should get back to work," Clara said, picking up the coffee pot. "Of course," James said, rising from his chair with the courteous gesture of a man raised to show respect to women. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation." As Clara turned to leave, James spoke again. "Miss Whitmore, if you do decide to stay in Copper Falls, I think you'll find it's a good place for people who aren't afraid of hard work." Clara smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I hope you're right, Mr. Patterson." An hour later, Clara watched from the inn's front window as James and his crew loaded their wagon and prepared to leave Copper Falls. She told herself she was simply curious about their departure, but she couldn't deny the small ache in her chest as she watched James mount his horse and take one last look around the town. For just a moment, his gaze seemed to linger on the inn, and Clara stepped back from the window, not wanting to be caught watching. When she looked again, the rescue team was already moving down Main Street toward the road that would take them back to Denver and whatever disaster awaited their expertise next. Clara spent the rest of the morning working alongside Ruth, learning the routines and responsibilities that would define her new life in Copper Falls. But throughout the day, she found her thoughts returning to her conversation with James, to the way he'd spoken about independence and responsibility, to the understanding she'd glimpsed in his storm-grey eyes. She was building a new life in this mountain town, but she was beginning to realize that some foundations were laid not just through work and determination, but through connections with people who understood the courage it took to keep going when everything familiar had been stripped away. James Patterson might be gone, but the conversation they'd shared had planted something in Clara's mind that would continue growing long after his wagon disappeared over the mountain pass. 3 months had passed since the mine collapse, and Clara had settled into a rhythm of life in Copper Falls that felt more natural than anything she'd ever known. The work at the inn was demanding but satisfying, ranging from scrubbing floors and changing linens to cooking meals and managing the books Ruth had gradually turned over to her capable hands. Clara discovered she had a talent for organization and a way with difficult guests that made even the most cantankerous traveling salesman leave the inn with grudging smiles. The winter had been harsh, with snow piling so deep against the inn's windows that some mornings Clara had to dig out the front door before they could open for business. But the isolation had given her time to think, to read books from Ruth's small library, and to write letters to no one in particular, filling pages with observations about mountain life and thoughts about the woman she was becoming in this place, so far from everything she'd once known. Spring arrived late, but spectacular, with wildflowers bursting from the hillsides and streams rushing full with snowmelt. The town began to stir with new energy as mining operations resumed at smaller claims around the area, though Silver Creek Mine remained sealed, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had brought Clara to Copper Falls in the first place. It was on a Tuesday morning in late April that Clara heard familiar voices in the inn's lobby while she was upstairs making beds. She paused in her work, recognizing the authoritative tone of someone giving instructions, the kind of voice that belonged to a person accustomed to being obeyed in dangerous situations. Her heart began to beat faster before her mind had fully processed why the voice seemed important. When she descended the stairs with an armload of linens, she found James Patterson standing at the front desk, travel-worn and serious, speaking with Ruth about room availability. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face more weathered, but his presence still commanded attention in the quiet space. He wore the same practical clothes she'd seen him in months earlier, though everything about him suggested long miles and little rest. "Mr. Patterson," Clara said, her voice carefully neutral despite the way her pulse had quickened, "what brings you back to Copper Falls?" James turned at the sound of her voice, and Clara caught a flicker of something that might have been relief in his expression before it settled back into professional courtesy. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "there's been another accident. The Riverside Mine, about 10 miles north of here. Cave-in yesterday morning. 5 men trapped." The news hit Clara like cold water, bringing back memories of the agonizing days when families had waited for word about their loved ones at Silver Creek. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Too early to tell," James replied. "The company sent for me this morning. My crew is already heading up there to assess the situation. I came here first because Ruth's Inn is the closest decent lodging to the site." Ruth, who had been listening to their exchange with the keen attention of someone who understood small-town dynamics, stepped forward. "Of course we have rooms available," she said. "Whatever you need, James. Clara, why don't you show Mr. Patterson upstairs while I get his paperwork sorted out?" Clara led James up the narrow staircase to the same room he'd occupied during his previous stay, acutely aware of his presence behind her on the creaking steps. The hallway seemed smaller with him in it, charged with an energy she didn't quite know how to navigate. "This is the same room you had before," she said, opening the door and stepping aside to let him enter. "I'll bring up fresh towels and water for washing." James set his traveling bag on the chair beside the window, then turned to face her. "Thank you," he said, then hesitated as if deciding whether to say something more. "You look well," he added finally. "Copper Falls seems to agree. With you. Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the observation. It's been a good place to start over, she said. Ruth has been wonderful, and the work keeps me busy. And you're happy? James asked, the question carrying more weight than casual. Politeness. Clara considered her answer carefully. Happy seemed too simple a word for the complex mix of contentment, purpose, and lingering loneliness that defined her life in Copper Falls. I'm building something here, she said finally. Something that belongs to me, that feels good even when it's difficult. James nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about. Building something worthwhile is never easy, he said, but it's worth the effort when you find the right foundation. There was something in the way he spoke about foundations that made Clara think he wasn't only talking about her situation in Copper Falls. Before she could explore the thought further, the sound of horses and wagons on the street below drew James to the window. That'll be my equipment wagon, he said, peering through the glass. I should get up to the mine site while there's still daylight. Clara joined him at the window, standing close enough to catch the scent of leather and mountain air that seemed to cling to his clothes. Below them, 3 men were unloading ropes, timber and tools from a heavy wagon with the efficiency of people who'd performed the same task too many times. How long do you think it will take? Clara asked, watching the preparations. Depends on what we find when we get down there, James replied. Could be a few hours if we're lucky, could be days if the situation is complicated. The company says they heard voices this morning, so at least some of the men are still alive. The mention of voices gave Clara hope, but she could see the tension in James's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he watched his crew work. She realized that for all his experience and expertise, every rescue operation probably felt like that first terrible day when he dug frantically for his father, never quite sure if his efforts would be enough. You'll find them, she said quietly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. James looked at her, studying her face as if trying to understand where her confidence came from. What makes you so sure? Because you don't give up, Clara said simply. Because you'll keep digging until there's nothing left to dig for. Because those men have families waiting for them, and you understand what that means. Something shifted in James's expression, a softening that made him look younger and more vulnerable than the commanding figure who'd been giving orders downstairs. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. Sometimes it helps to have someone believe in the outcome. Clara felt the urge to reach out, to touch his hand or his arm in a gesture of comfort, but she held herself back, uncertain about the boundaries of their acquaintance. Instead, she stepped away from the window, creating distance that felt both necessary and regrettable. I'll let you get ready, she said. There's a wash basin on the stand, and I'll bring up hot water in a few minutes. Clara, James said as she reached the door, using her first name for the first time. She turned back to him, her hand still on the doorknob. It's good to see you again. The simple statement carried more warmth than a more elaborate compliment. Might have, and Clara felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with a connection she was only beginning to acknowledge. It's good to see you too, she replied, then slipped out of the room before either of them could say anything that might complicate the careful equilibrium they were maintaining. For the rest of the day, Clara found herself distracted from her usual duties, listening for sounds from James's room, watching for signs of activity at the mine site visible from the inn's upper windows. Ruth noticed her preoccupation and commented on it with the gentle directness of someone who'd been observing human nature for 7 decades. He's a good man, Ruth said, as they prepared dinner in the kitchen. But he's carrying a heavy load. Some folks might find that burden too much to share. Clara looked up from the potato she was peeling, meeting Ruth's knowing gaze. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do. Ruth replied with a small smile. "I've seen the way you watch for him, heard how your voice changes when you talk about him. There's nothing wrong with caring about someone, dear, but James Patterson is a complicated man with a dangerous job and a past that follows him everywhere he goes." Clara returned to her peeling, using the repetitive motion to buy time while she considered Ruth's words. "I'm not looking for complications," she said finally. "I've built a good life here, and I'm not interested in throwing it away for romantic notions." "Sometimes the best things in life are complicated," Ruth observed. "The question is whether they're worth the complications they bring." That evening, James returned to the inn after dark, exhausted and covered in dirt, but with news that brought cautious optimism. His crew had made contact with the trapped miners and determined that all 5 were alive, though one was injured and would need careful extraction. The rescue operation would continue through the night and into the next day, but James was confident they could bring everyone out safely. Clara served him dinner in the empty dining room, setting down plates of roast beef and vegetables with the quiet efficiency she'd perfected over months of caring for guests. James ate with the focused attention of someone who needed fuel for the work ahead, but Clara noticed the way his eyes tracked her movements around the room, as if he was storing up details for later consideration. "Will you go back up tonight?" Clara asked, refilling his coffee cup. "In a few hours," James replied. "We're working in shifts to keep fresh people on the dangerous work. No point in risking more lives because someone's too tired to think clearly." Clara nodded, understanding the logic, but worried about James pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. "When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" James paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, as if the question had never occurred to him. "I sleep when the work is finished," he said finally. "That's not an answer," Clara observed, sitting across from him at the table. "You can't save everyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I won't collapse," James said, but Clara heard the defensive edge in his voice that suggested she'd touched on something he preferred not to examine too closely. "How many rescue operations have you led in the past year?" Clara asked, leaning forward slightly. James set down his fork, studying her face as if trying to understand where her questions were leading. 15, maybe 16. Why? And in all that time, did you ever take a break? A week or two to rest somewhere that wasn't defined by other people's emergencies? The question hung in the air between them, and Clara watched as James considered an answer that clearly didn't come easily. "There's always another emergency," he said finally. "Another family waiting for news about someone they love. How do you rest when you know people are counting on you?" Clara recognized the weight of responsibility in his voice, the same burden she'd carried in smaller ways when she'd worked herself to exhaustion at the textile mill, believing that her dedication could somehow make up for circumstances beyond her control. "You rest so you can be better for the people who need you next," she said gently. "You rest because burning yourself out doesn't honor the people you've saved or the ones you couldn't." James looked at her with surprise, as if no one had ever suggested that taking care of himself might be part of taking care of others. "You sound like you speak from experience." Clara smiled, thinking of the years she'd worked double shifts and skipped meals, believing that sacrifice was the same thing as virtue. "I used to think that working myself to death proved how much I cared about doing good work," she said. "It took me a long time to learn that exhaustion isn't the same thing as dedication." "And what changed your mind?" James asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Coming here," Clara said simply. "Learning that taking care of myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary if I wanted to take care of other people properly. Ruth taught me that you can't pour from an empty pitcher." James considered this, absently turning his coffee cup in his hands. "It's easier to focus on other people's problems," he admitted. "Keeps you from thinking too much about your own." Clara understood that admission, recognized the truth in it from her own experience of using work and worry about others to avoid examining the loneliness and uncertainty in her own life. What would you think about if you stopped moving long? Enough to let the thoughts catch up? The question seemed to surprise James with its directness. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee, as if the answer might be written in the dark liquid. That maybe I've been running from the same tragedy for 15 years, he said finally. That maybe I keep trying to save other people's fathers because I couldn't save my own. The honesty in his admission made Clara's chest ache with sympathy. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a gesture of comfort that felt both natural and revolutionary. Maybe, she said softly, but maybe you keep saving people because you understand how much it matters, because you know what it feels like to lose someone important, because you have the skills and the courage to make a difference when everything seems hopeless. James looked down at their joined hands, then up at Clara's face, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude for her words. I should go back up to the mine, he said, but he didn't move to withdraw his hand from beneath hers. You should, Clara agreed, but first you should rest for an hour or two, so you can think clearly when those men need you most. James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face and made Clara realize how much she'd been hoping to see that expression again. Is that a professional recommendation from an innkeeper who knows about taking care of people? It's a suggestion from someone who cares about your success, Clara said, then felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how much her words revealed. James turned his hand over beneath hers, briefly squeezing her fingers before gently withdrawing from her touch. Thank you, he said, standing from the table, for the dinner, the conversation, and the advice, all of it. Clara watched him leave the dining room, then sat alone at the table for a long time, thinking about the conversation they'd shared and the feelings it had stirred in her. She'd built a good life in Copper Falls, a life that was stable and satisfying and entirely her own. But sitting across from James, listening to him talk about his work and his past, she'd felt something awaken in her that she hadn't expected to feel again. She'd felt the possibility of sharing that life with someone who understood both its value and its challenges, someone who knew what it meant to build something worthwhile from the wreckage of broken dreams. The realization both thrilled and terrified her because it meant considering changes she hadn't planned for, risks she hadn't anticipated when she'd decided to make Copper Falls her home. But as Clara finally rose from the table and began clearing away the dishes, she found herself thinking about what Ruth had said about complicated things sometimes being worth the complications they brought. Maybe it was time to find out if that wisdom applied to matters of the heart as well as matters of practical living. The successful rescue at Riverside Mine should have been a moment of pure celebration, but James returned to the inn on the third evening with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. All 5 miners had been brought out alive, including the injured man who would recover fully with time and care. The families had wept with relief. The mining company had paid James's fee without question, and the local newspaper had run a story praising the expert rescue operation that had saved 5 lives. But Clara could see the weight James carried. As he sat alone in the dining room, mechanically eating the meal she'd prepared while staring out the window at the darkening mountains. She'd learned to read the signs of a man processing more than physical exhaustion, someone wrestling with thoughts that couldn't be solved through rope work and timber shoring. The injured man, Clara said, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. He's the same age as your brother would have been. James's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and he looked at her with surprise that quickly shifted to something deeper, more vulnerable. How did you know about my brother? Ruth mentioned it, Clara said gently. She said you lost him in another collapse 2 years after your father. I saw your face when you were talking about the injured miner today, saw how you stayed with him longer than the others. James set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, as if Clara's observation had removed some invisible barrier he'd been maintaining. Marcus would have been 26 next month, he said quietly. Same age as Tom Riverside, same reckless grin, same way of making everyone around him laugh even when things looked hopeless. Clara waited, understanding that James was sharing something he rarely discussed, perhaps something he'd never said aloud to another person. Marcus wanted to follow me into rescue work after what happened to our father, James continued. I told him to find safer work, to build a life that didn't involve crawling into death traps for people he'd never met. But he was stubborn, said. Someone had to watch my back, since I was too foolish to watch it myself. The pain in James's voice made Clara's chest tighten with sympathy. She could imagine a younger brother's determination to protect someone he admired, the kind of loyalty that couldn't be reasoned away with practical arguments. What happened? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Tunnel collapse in a silver mine outside Colorado Springs, James said, his voice becoming flat and distant. I was leading the crew. Marcus was working backup support. The whole thing came down without warning, tons of rock and timber. I got out because I was near the entrance checking equipment. Marcus was deeper in, helping to shore up a weak section. James paused, staring at his hands, as if seeing them covered in the dirt and blood of that terrible day. I dug for him for 6 hours before the official rescue team arrived, then worked alongside them for 2 more days. Found him on the 3rd day, still wearing the safety rope I'd taught him to tie, still carrying the whistle I'd given him to signal for help. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the image of James finding his brother too late, despite all his training and expertise. I'm so sorry, she whispered. The worst part was that he might have survived if I'd been better, faster, smarter about reading the warning signs, James said. I'd been doing rescue work for 3 years by then, thought I knew everything there was to know about cave-ins and structural collapse. But I missed something, and Marcus paid the price for my overconfidence. Clara understood then why James drove himself so relentlessly, why he took every rescue personally, why he never seemed to rest between disasters. He wasn't just trying to save other people's fathers and brothers and sons. He was trying to prove that his skills were worth the lives that had been lost, developing them. You can't save Marcus by saving everyone else, Clara said gently. And you can't honor his memory by destroying yourself with guilt. James looked at her sharply, as if her words had struck closer to home than he was comfortable acknowledging. What would you have me do? Stop helping people because it's painful? Let other families go through what mine did because I can't handle the emotional cost? I would have you help people because you want to, not because you feel you have to, Clara replied. I would have you take care of yourself well enough to do good work for the right reasons, not burn yourself out trying to fix something that can't be fixed. The challenge in her voice seemed to surprise James, and Clara saw him struggle with the idea that his motivations might be more complicated than simple altruism. You think I'm helping people for selfish reasons? I think you're helping people for human reasons, Clara said, which include grief and guilt and love and hope all tangled up together. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not sustainable if you never acknowledge what you're really trying to accomplish. James was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words with the serious consideration he gave to technical problems that required careful analysis. And what do you think I'm really trying to accomplish? Clara hesitated, knowing that her answer might change the careful balance they'd maintained in their growing friendship. But the honesty James had shown her deserved an equally honest response. I think you're trying to prove that you're worthy of surviving when people you loved didn't, she said. I think you're trying to earn the right to live by saving enough lives to balance the scales. And I think you're afraid that if you stop moving long enough to grieve properly, you'll fall apart completely. The accuracy of her assessment seemed to hit James like a physical blow. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to meet her gaze, with an expression that was both grateful and terrified. "You see too much," he said quietly. "I recognize the pattern," Clara replied. "I spent years working myself to exhaustion, trying to prove I was worth the food I ate and the space I took up in the world. It's a lonely way to live, always trying to earn something that should be given freely." James studied her face, and Clara had the feeling he was seeing her fully for the first time, understanding that her insights came from experience rather than abstract sympathy. "What changed for you?" "Coming here," Clara said simply, "finding people who valued me for who I was, not what I could produce or prove. Learning that worth isn't something you earn through suffering, it's something you discover through accepting yourself as deserving of good things." "That sounds easier than it is," James observed. "Much easier," Clara agreed, "but possible if you have the right people around you to remind you when you forget." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the inn's front door, followed by the sound of Ruth's voice greeting someone in the lobby. Clara heard footsteps on the stairs, then Ruth appeared in the dining room doorway with an expression of carefully controlled concern. "James," Ruth said, her voice tight with worry. "There's a telegram for you. The messenger said it was urgent." James took the yellow paper from Ruth's hands and read it quickly, his face growing pale as he absorbed the contents. Clara watched his expression shift from surprise to determination, to something that looked like dread. "What is it?" Clara asked, though she feared she already knew. "Mine explosion in Glenwood Springs," James said, his voice becoming brisk and professional. 17 men trapped, possibly more. They want me there as soon as possible." Clara felt her heart sink, though she tried to keep her disappointment from showing on her face. "When do you leave?" "First train tomorrow morning," James replied, already standing from the table. "I need to send word to my crew, arrange for equipment transport, coordinate with the local authorities." The transformation was immediate and complete. The vulnerable man who'd been sharing his deepest fears became the competent rescue leader who could organize complex operations under pressure. Clara admired his professionalism, even as she mourned the loss of the intimate conversation they'd been sharing. "Of course," she said, rising from her own chair. "I'll pack some food for your journey." James paused in his preparations, looking at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said, "for the food and for listening earlier. It helped to talk about Marcus." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. She watched James leave the dining room with the quick, purposeful stride of someone already mentally focused on the next crisis, and felt the familiar ache of being left behind by circumstances beyond her control. That night, Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of James packing in the room above hers, the scrape of boots on floorboards and the rustle of equipment being organized for another dangerous journey. She found herself thinking about the conversation they'd shared, about the pain she'd seen in his eyes when he talked about his brother, about the recognition that had passed between them when she'd described her own struggles with feeling worthy of happiness. Somewhere in the space of that conversation, Clara realized she'd fallen in love with James Patterson, not the competent rescue leader who commanded respect and admiration, but the grieving man who carried too much responsibility and had forgotten how to rest. She loved his dedication, even as she worried about the cost it extracted from him. She loved his honesty, even as she feared the walls he built around his heart to protect himself from more loss. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a strange sense of peace. She'd built a good life in Copper Falls, But love was asking her to consider building something even better, something that included sharing both joys and burdens with someone who understood the price of caring deeply about things that mattered. The next morning, Clara rose early to prepare breakfast for James and help him gather supplies for his journey. She moved through the familiar tasks with automatic efficiency, while her mind wrestled with words she wanted to say, but wasn't sure she had the right to speak. James appeared in the kitchen dressed for travel, his equipment bag slung over his shoulder and his face already set in the focused expression she'd learned to associate with his departure for dangerous work. But when he saw her packing food into a canvas bag, something softened in his expression. "You don't need to do this," he said, but his voice carried gratitude rather than protest. "I want to," Clara replied, continuing to wrap sandwiches and pack fruit with careful attention to detail. "It's not much, but it might save you from having to rely on whatever food is available near the mine site." James watched her work for a moment, then moved closer, close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of his presence at her shoulder. "Clara," he said quietly, and something in his voice made her hands still on the canvas bag. She turned to face him, surprised by his proximity and by the intensity in his storm-grey eyes. "What is it?" "Last night, when we were talking about reasons for doing things and taking care of yourself," James said, his voice careful and deliberate, "you made me think about things I've been avoiding for a long time." Clara felt her heart begin to race, sensing that whatever James was about to say might change everything between them. "What kind of things?" "Things like what I want my life to look like when the work is finished," James said. "Things like whether there's room for anything besides other people's emergencies. Things like whether someone like me has any right to ask someone like you to wait while I figure out how to be a whole person instead of just a useful one." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming tenderness she felt for this man who was finally asking questions about his own happiness. "What if someone like me was willing to wait?" she asked softly. "What if someone like me thought you were already worth waiting for, even before you figured everything out?" James reached up and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. "Then I'd say that someone like you deserves better than a man who disappears every time someone else needs help, who can't promise when he'll be back or whether he'll come back whole." Clara covered his hand with hers, holding it against her, face as if she could anchor him to this moment, to this choice. "What if someone like me thought that love was about supporting each other through difficult work, not avoiding it? What if someone like me believed that the best things in life are worth fighting for, even when the fighting is complicated?" James smiled then, the same transformative expression she'd seen the night before, but this time it carried something deeper, more hopeful. "Then I'd say that someone like me is the luckiest man alive, and that someone like you deserves to hear that every day until she believes it." He leaned forward and kissed her then, gentle and careful and full of promise. Clara felt herself melt into the warmth of his touch, into the possibility of a future that included both her independence and this surprising love that had grown from friendship and understanding. When they broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers, his eyes serious despite the smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. "I have to go," he said. "There are people waiting for help." "I know," Clara replied, "but now I know you're planning to come back." "To you," James said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "Always to you." Clara watched from the inn's front porch as James's wagon disappeared down the mountain road, carrying him toward another disaster, another test of his skills and courage. But this time, she didn't feel abandoned or forgotten. This time, she felt like she was part of something larger than herself, something worth building despite the challenges it would bring. She had work to do at the inn, a life to maintain in Copper Falls, dreams to pursue that belonged entirely to her. But now she also had something else, the knowledge that love could coexist with independence, that two people could support each other's purposes without losing themselves in the process. The telegram from Glenwood Springs had been a test, Clara realized, but not the kind either of them had expected. It had been a test of whether they could choose each other while still remaining true to the work and the dreams that defined them as individuals. And somehow, miraculously, they had passed. The explosion at Glenwood Springs had been worse than anyone anticipated. What started as a routine mine rescue became a week-long operation that tested every skill James had developed over years of dangerous work. Clara received brief telegrams every other day, terse messages that told her he was alive, but revealed nothing about the emotional toll the work was taking on him. She threw herself into her duties at the inn, but found herself watching the road constantly, listening for the sound of wagons that might bring news. When James finally returned to Copper Falls 2 weeks later, Clara barely recognized the man who climbed down from the supply wagon. He moved like someone who'd been broken and hastily reassembled, his face gaunt with exhaustion and marked by new lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. She wanted to run to him immediately, but something in his posture warned her to wait, to let him come to her when he was ready. James spent 3 days at the inn without seeking her out beyond polite nods in the hallway. Clara respected his need for space while wrestling with her own fears about what the rescue operation might have cost him. Ruth, who'd been watching both of them with the sharp eye of someone who understood human nature, finally intervened on the 4th morning. "That man is sitting in his room staring at the wall like he's forgotten how to live," Ruth said, finding Clara in the kitchen, where she was aggressively kneading bread dough. "And you're working yourself into exhaustion trying not to think about it. Someone needs to break this stalemate before you both drive yourselves mad." Clara paused in her kneading, flour dusting her hands and apron. "He told me he'd come back." To me, but maybe that was before he realized what coming back would cost him. Maybe he's changed his mind about what he can handle. Or maybe he's scared that what happened in Glenwood Springs proves he was right to think he doesn't deserve happiness, Ruth countered. "Maybe he's testing whether you meant what you said about fighting for complicated things." That afternoon, Clara knocked on James's door with a tray of food and a determination to break through whatever walls he'd rebuilt around himself. She found him sitting by the window, fully dressed but motionless, as if he'd forgotten his purpose in the world, along with his appetite. "You missed lunch," Clara said, setting the tray on the small table beside his chair. "And breakfast. And dinner last night?" James looked at the food without interest, then up at Clara's face, with eyes that seemed to have trouble focusing on the present moment. "I'm not very hungry," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Clara settled into the chair across from him, close enough to study the new damage written in the lines around his eyes and the hollow spaces beneath his cheekbones. "Tell me what happened," she said simply. 17 men went down," James said, after a long pause. "We got 12 out alive. 5 didn't make it." Clara waited, understanding that the bare facts were just the beginning of whatever was tearing at James's heart. She'd learned to read the weight he carried, to recognize when loss had carved new wounds in his already scarred soul. "One of them was just 16, James continued, his voice becoming distant. "Lied about his age to get the job, said his family needed the money. Reminded me so much of Marcus that first day he went underground, all bravado and terror mixed, together." Clara felt her chest tighten as she began to understand what had happened. "You tried to reach him." "I got close," James said, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. Close enough to hear him calling for his mother, close enough to touch his hand before the next section came down. We had to choose between risking more lives going after him or saving the men we could still reach safely. The impossible choice hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of decisions no one should have to make. Clara could imagine James in that moment, torn between his professional judgment and his desperate need to save every life within reach. "You made the right choice," Clara said quietly. "Did I?" James asked, looking at her with raw pain. 12. Families got their men back because I chose to abandon one boy who might have survived if I'd been willing to risk more. How do you weigh 12 lives against one? How do you live with knowing you could have tried harder? Clara understood then that James wasn't just grieving the boy who died in Glenwood Springs. He was reliving every loss, every impossible choice, every moment when his human limitations had proven inadequate to the scope of other people's tragedies. "You live with it by accepting that you're not God," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You live with it by understanding that saving 12 lives is extraordinary, not insufficient. You live with it by honoring that boy's memory through continuing to do work that matters, not by destroying yourself with guilt." James shook his head, as if her words couldn't penetrate the wall of self-recrimination he'd built. "That boy died calling for his mother while I calculated risks and made practical decisions. What kind of man does that make me?" "It makes you the kind of man who saves people," Clara replied. "The kind of man who makes terrible choices so other people don't have to. The kind of man who carries the weight of other people's tragedies because you're strong enough to bear it." She leaned forward, reaching for his hands and holding them despite their resistance. "James, you've spent 15 years trying to save everyone because you couldn't save your father and brother. But that boy in Glenwood Springs isn't Marcus, and you can't bring Marcus back by dying inside every time you can't perform miracles." Something cracked in James's expression, a fissure in the armor he'd been wearing against his own emotions. "I promised you I'd come back," he said, his voice breaking, "but I don't know how to come back from this. I don't know how to live with failing again." Clara rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to meet her eyes. "You didn't fail," she said fiercely. "You succeeded at something incredibly difficult and dangerous. You brought 12 men home to their families. You did work that mattered, work that required courage and skill and sacrifice." Tears began to slip down James's cheeks, the first real emotion Clara had seen from him since his return. "It doesn't feel like success," he whispered. "Because you're measuring yourself against an impossible standard," Clara replied. "Because you think love has to be earned through perfect performance instead of given freely to imperfect people who are doing their best." She pulled him toward her, and James finally allowed himself to break, sobbing into her shoulder with the raw grief of someone who'd been holding too much pain for too long. Clara held him as he wept for the boy in Glenwood Springs, for his brother Marcus, for his father, for all the lives he'd been unable to save despite his best efforts. When the storm of emotion finally passed, James pulled back to look at Clara's face, his eyes red but somehow clearer than they'd been since his return. "I love you," he said, as if the words had been torn from him by the force of his grief. "I love you, and I'm terrified that loving me will destroy you the way this work destroys me." Clara smiled through her own tears, seeing past his fear. To the man who'd been hiding beneath layers of guilt and responsibility. "I love you too," she said simply, "and I'm not afraid of being destroyed by love. I'm afraid of missing the chance to build something beautiful with someone who understands what it means to care deeply about difficult things." James searched her face, as if looking for signs of doubt or reservation. "I can't promise I'll never have to leave for rescue work. I can't promise there won't be more losses, more times when I come back broken and needing to be put back together. "I don't need those promises," Clara said. "I need the promise that you'll keep coming back to me, that you'll let me help carry the weight when it gets too heavy, that you'll trust me to love you even when you can't love yourself." James kissed her then, desperate and grateful, and full of the kind of hope that comes from being seen completely and accepted anyway. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in as if she were oxygen after too long underwater. "Marry me," he said, the words coming out as both question and prayer. "Marry me and help me figure out how to be the kind of man who deserves what you're offering." Clara laughed, the sound bright with joy and relief. "You already are that kind of man," she said. "You just forgot for a while." 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, when the aspen trees blazed gold against the mountain sky, Clara stood in the small church where they'd mourned the Silver Creek miners and prepared to marry the man who'd taught her that love could coexist with independence, that two people could support each other's purposes without losing themselves in the process. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and a dress she'd sewn herself, simple cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. James wore his best suit and a nervous smile, flanked by Ben Murphy and 2 members of his rescue crew who'd traveled from Denver for the ceremony. Ruth sat in the front pew, beaming like a proud mother, while most of Copper Falls packed the remaining seats to witness the wedding of the innkeeper's assistant and the rescue leader who'd proven that heroes could be human. The ceremony was simple, but profound, vows spoken with the gravity of people who understood that promises were sacred things, meant to be kept through joy and sorrow alike. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Clara with tender reverence, as if sealing not just their marriage, but their commitment to building a life that honored both their individual dreams and their shared love. The reception in the church basement was filled with mountain music and stories, neighbors celebrating 2 people who'd found each other through tragedy and chose to create something hopeful from the wreckage of their original plans. Clara danced with James to fiddle music while the whole town looked on, marveling at how the reserved rescue leader laughed and spun his bride around the makeshift dance floor. Later that evening, as they walked from the church to the small house James had rented on the outskirts of town, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd come to Copper Falls expecting to marry a stranger and build a conventional life around his dreams and needs. Instead, she'd buried that stranger, built her own dreams, and found a love that enhanced rather than replaced her independence. "Any regrets?" James asked, catching her reflective mood as they paused on their front porch to look up at the stars scattered across the clear mountain sky. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about Thomas Brennan and the life she'd originally planned, about the factory work she'd left behind, and the uncertain future she'd embraced in coming west. "Just one," she said finally, smiling at James's surprised expression. "I regret that it took a tragedy to bring us together. I would have liked to have met you under happier circumstances." James pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist as he considered her words. "Maybe we needed the tragedy," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we both had to lose our original plans before we could find something better than what we'd imagined for ourselves." Clara knew he was right. She'd needed to lose Thomas and the security of an arranged marriage to discover her own strength and capability. James had needed to face his deepest fears about failure and worthiness, to understand that love was about accepting imperfection, not achieving it. "Besides," James added, kissing the top of her head, "if you'd met me under happier circumstances, you might not have been impressed by my ability to dig people out of collapsed mines." Clara laughed, tilting her head back to look at him. "I think I would have been impressed by your kindness, your integrity, and your terrible habit of working yourself to exhaustion for other people's benefit. The mine rescue skills would have been bonus. They went inside their small house, with its simple furniture and large windows that looked out toward the mountains, where they both found purposes worth pursuing and love worth fighting for. Clara had kept her job at the inn, working with Ruth to expand their services to accommodate the increasing number of business travelers coming through Copper Falls. James had established a training center where he taught mining companies how to prevent accidents and handle emergencies, work that allowed him to save lives proactively rather than reactively. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a real one, built on honest acknowledgement of their individual needs and shared commitment to supporting each other's growth. They faced challenges together, celebrated successes as a team, and learned to navigate the complex balance between personal independence and marital partnership. On quiet evenings, Clara would find James reading technical manuals by lamplight, always studying new methods and technologies that might save more lives in future emergencies. She no longer worried that his dedication to rescue work would consume him, because she'd learned to see it as an expression of his character rather than an escape from his emotions. And James would watch Clara manage the inn's books or plan improvements to their guest services, marveling at her natural business instincts and the confidence she'd developed in making decisions that affected other people's comfort and welfare. He no longer feared that loving her would make him weak, because he'd discovered that sharing his burdens with someone who understood their importance actually made him stronger. They were two people who'd found each other through loss and chose to build something lasting from the pieces of their broken original plans. Their love wasn't the fairy tale romance of novels, but something more valuable. A partnership between equals who respected each other's strengths, supported each other's growth, and understood that the best things in life were worth fighting for, even when the fighting was complicated. In Copper Falls, where the mountains stood eternal and the seasons cycled through beauty and hardship with predictable grace, Clara and James Patterson built a life that proved love could flourish in the space between independence and commitment. Between individual dreams and shared purpose, between the person you thought you were meant to be and the person you discovered you could become when you were brave enough to start over. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.